Okay, so welcome everybody. Today is the 20th of June 2018. We are starting our official API Machinery SIG meeting for this week. And I will defer to Daniel and David to start for the first point.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this one. So I think this got added to the agenda because were we trying to serve CRDs consistently or something? Anyway, I'm noticing a pattern where there's no good way for API servers to do things sort of at the same time, right? Like if we want to sync up Discover, so the scenario here is you're in an HA situation, and we have to consider like the maximally hard case where you're doing a rolling upgrade of API server. It's very similar problem to I've turned on a CRD and I'm not sure if all of the API servers have turned it on yet or not. Additionally, there's like, suppose I do a rolling update and toggle in API server flag, like I turn a group on or off by runtime config. There's also, say I add an API service, like a aggregated API server. How do I know when that has been added to API server? So there's sort of, I think, two components to the problem. One is, for some things, users need to know when we're done, when it's active. And there's also like, to support that, I think API server itself needs to have some information about the state of other API servers in the system. So I think it's a fairly difficult problem, and I haven't seen like a coherent design to address the problem. So this is mostly a problem statement. I'm asking everybody to be aware of it. Think about it. If you see problems, or if you see PRs coming in that do something related to this, like think about it. Does the additional behavior make sense? Is it something that we need to solve globally? So
yeah, I agree that it is a general problem that we have. I don't think that I'd be inclined to block pulls that do not make that problem worse, though.
Yeah, if you're not making it worse, that's fine.
Well, you have a comment down there, should we block new dynamic config work until we have a general mechanism? I'm disinclined to block something like there was one on the agenda just a moment ago. I'm not sure who pulled it off, but there was one about dynamic auditing support.
So I guess we need some sort of forcing function to make this better. I'm okay with additive things that don't go in a wrong direction and also don't change this behavior. I'm not okay with adding things that solve this piecemeal without considering the whole thing, because that makes the problem larger instead of making it smaller.
It can. Now, there's also, I think Stefan added this comment about config Z. I have issues with a config Z endpoint.
Yeah, config Z endpoint is not going to work out because it's not a real API. Yeah. We can't do that. Whatever mechanism we use to surface the sort of information to users needs to go into the status field of a real API. Like, I don't see any other way to do it.
Status field, and I don't know that I would be strongly against a config Z endpoint once we actually had something typed to return that was going to be stable. But
yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of depends on what you're going to put in the config Z endpoint. Like, another aspect of this is we need to look at the flags that API server takes on the command line. I think there's two categories. One is like specific things about this API server on this host, and the other is flags that need to be synchronized between all API servers in order to make sense. And really, like flipping a flag in the latter category requires like a rolling, a rolling update or something of that nature.
So in that case, though, I don't know. So I see something like the dynamic auditing, it's dynamic config for auditing, as analogous to dynamic admission, where you want to have a uniform set of audit rules across your cluster.
Right.
And I see that as distinct from something like I want to set a particular flag on the Kube API server to, I don't know, change its host bind parameter or something, right? So
yeah, I imagine like I don't know, the advertise address flag. Do we still support that one?
Maybe.
Yeah, we used to have this flag that like controlled what it advertised itself to in the Kubernetes service. Like all API servers really need to agree on that, or they're going to fight over creating the Kubernetes service.
Yeah, all Kubernetes API servers. So I think there are actually three categories. There's things specific to a particular instance, like the IP of this machine. Then there are settings that must be consistent between all API servers in an HA set. So all Kube API servers, or all of a particular aggregated API server.
And then there's ones that must be consistent throughout the entire control plane, like the admission
and audit.
Yeah,
exactly.
So that's a good addition. Yeah, I agree. There's three categories.
So to be clear, I am disinclined to stop forward work in that last category where all API servers, regardless of type in the cluster, need to agree on a thing. I don't think that we should stop people from progressing on those. I agree that we should let people continue to add things. I think we shouldn't let them. We should make sure that they add things that still have this problem, basically. Rather, unless they're offering a solution that can be generalized, because I don't want like one-off solutions for each of these things. That seems like a poor state to end up in. Yeah, and David mentioned admission webhooks. I think I forgot to mention that as one of the things that like admission and maybe auth-z and maybe auth-in are also things that have this problem. So I don't know. I'd be happy. I guess this is mostly informational update. I'd be happy to see designs or discussion or issues.
Yeah, I think it just got scoped down to kind of strip out a lot of the multi-level cluster scope namespace scoped bits to not try to subdivide like policy around what kinds of audit you should be able to set, like basically letting the dynamic version have the same ability as the currently provided static version. And
that's fine. Yeah,
if a cluster administrator doesn't want to expose themselves that way, then they can not enable this.
Yeah, like even like dynamic auditing should be like, we should be careful with that API. Like if it's referencing, say, a file on the file system as a destination for dynamic auditing, that should not be in an API that's shared among all API servers, right? Because that file could be different in different hosts.
Right. So I think the remaining questions were, is the dynamic bit a singleton initially, or does it allow for multiple destinations with different policies? The former is a much easier path from where we are today, but pretty limited. The latter requires possibly requires big changes to the audit pipeline, which today is optimized around short-circuiting and not doing any more work once the policy says no more detail is needed. So I think those were the last two kind of questions left. Singleton versus, are we going to target singleton or multiple? And are we only going to target webhooks for the dynamic auditing?
Yeah, so what we've kind of come to this week, I've talked with Joe pretty extensively about it, and he wants to kind of scope down, at least to get the initial proposal in, just to not have the policy be dynamically configured and just have the webhooks just basically allow, a single, or I guess it could be multiple webhooks, but they would work off that statically configured policy. And then he wants to kind of focus on that piece and then worry about the dynamic policy down the road, just so we can iteratively get this stuff through and agreed upon.
So just to clarify something I said earlier, I as much as I don't want a bad solution to this, I'm even less inclined to have more additional static configuration for like webhooks and stuff. So I do agree that having webhooks dynamically configured is definitely the way to go.
Cool.
Yeah. But,
so I guess there is a question there still, now that we've scoped it down to just doing the webhooks. Do we want to allow multiple webhooks, or do we want that to be a singleton object initially, like Jordan just mentioned? If we
I'm in favor of allowing multiple webhooks. We didn't allow multiple webhooks for the auth-z endpoint at first, and I think that was problematic. So
yeah,
so technically, I'm
in favor of that as well, but it is not a simple drop-in. There's a lot of work to get the pipeline supporting disparate policies. So
I think it's possible, but it scales with a number of webhooks. This must be clear.
Yes,
so it's a lot of work overhead.
Yeah, you should carefully consider whether you really need the overhead of multiple sources. On the other hand, if you use the rule system that we use for the admission webhooks, you could have different resources audited by different audit backends or whatever. So maybe you'd only configure it so that any particular resource got to one sync. I don't know.
I definitely think there's a use for having multiple backends and maybe different policies for those. So it's tricky. I mean, we're trying to, I guess, skip it down to just talking about the webhooks. I definitely think there's a use for multiple webhooks, but I do heed the warning that may be difficult.
Okay. Yeah, I think it makes sense to have multiple webhooks. Like I can imagine like people making standard consumers of or servers for these webhooks for various audit backends, and maybe if you want to roll over from one to the other, it makes sense to enable both for a while. So I think that's nice to users. That doesn't mean it's worth the cost.
Sure.
And it's also as long as you don't make the API too horrible, it doesn't exclude like doing it first for one webhook with like an obvious path to extending it to multiple webhooks.
Yeah, I think I'll probably just skip the work and we can take it from there.
Yeah. Okay. Does that cover it for the dynamic auditing input that you need from this group?
Yeah, so we're just looking to try and get the first version of this with just the webhooks being dynamically configured, basically taking the flags and putting those into configuration objects. We're looking to get that merged sooner than later. So if you have any input, please throw it in there now, so we can get over at least this initial piece of just taking those specific flags and making them configurable.
Yeah. If you're looking for my input specifically, I'm afraid that you're going to have to harass me over Slack. I'm sorry it's come down to that, but I have more to do than I can reasonably accomplish. So,
no worries. I know we have a couple of reviewers from API Machinery. So.
Okay, yeah. If Jordan's looking at it, I'm pretty okay with that.
Cool.
Okay.
Antoine, you wanted to talk about dry run?
Dry run, yeah. So I'm proposing API server dry run. This is kind of orthogonal to the server-side apply.
Yes.
But this is going to go directly in master, not in the feature branch we have for server-side apply.
Mm-hmm. We're open for where the freeze is unfroze, so it can go in master now.
Yay. So I'm proposing we have a query parameter to specify dry run. We already prepared the API server in 1.11.
Yeah, I think we're already agreed on the query parameter.
Yeah. So I'm proposing also passing a flag to admission controllers, both dynamic and static.
Yes, that seems necessary.
Avoid having side effects for dry run, specifically quotas, for example. And also changing the storage layer so that we would avoid storing the object in case of a dry run. The goal is to go as deep as we can in the stack so that we can return an object that is going to be as close as possible as it would have been stored. The goal is to get an idea of what would have happened if it had happened without having it happen. This can be useful for Gitbots, diff, and validation in general.
Yeah, so it looks fairly straightforward, but there are a couple things worth noting. We talked in the comments about admission controller config. It seems like a good idea to force an admission, a webhook admission piece to say, yes, I support dry run, because not supporting dry run and being called is kind of a big deal. And it can default to false now and to true later in a later version, because we know we're going to have more versions to come when it goes GA. The other was inside of our actual storage stack. There are REST interfaces for things like there's like REST update, graceful deletion, creator, things like that. I think it's going to be worth having a new interface there for things that support dry run, so that when someone enters a new level of queue, they will actually get a compile failure when they try to use it. And I am ringing how obnoxious. And so, and there was one other. The behavior of something like quota. Daniel just typed.
Yes.
Different people want to do different things. So I think it's worth noting that the behavior quota, I think we all agree quota should not bump usage. But whether or not quota should reject is less obvious to me. Some people want to use dry run to see if they have enough quota. Other people want to use dry run to see what the object would look like. And so if quota rejects, it makes it impossible to fulfill that latter use case.
Clayton was actually asking about like different purposes. So like it not just being a Boolean, but like why are you dry running? Are you dry running to validate? Are you dry running to do the full admission chain? Like what is your purpose?
Is that really necessary?
I think it's going to be, because there are cases that I'm going to want to validate without doing admission.
But if you don't go through validating admission, have you really validated?
Well, there's lots of reasons why something is valid for an object, but not valid to create on this server at this time.
I think if you want to run schema validation, that's not the same as dry run.
Yeah, dry run, like taking it piecemeal, I don't know how are those results useful?
The quota one is one that I know of, right? So Derek, for some reason, at some previous time, had wanted to be able to do a dry run to see if he had space in quota. Do I get a rejection from quota?
Yeah, that's what I would anticipate it doing.
On the other hand, Caesar, a couple days ago, came to me and said, I want to look at the object that would be created for me. Regardless of whether quota would succeed or fail, I want to see what object would be created.
Yeah.
And so I want not n. And
sorry, go ahead, David.
So wanting n and not n is pretty difficult.
Yeah, and the other cases here is like there's different types of UIs. A CLI is not the same as a web UI. A web UI, I don't necessarily need to validate a controller that somebody's building an experience around like a deployment. Doesn't need the same thing that the deployment controller needs when it needs to validate, or when you're creating a pod directly. So I'd be like, even at the highest level, we just say don't put Booleans at a general level. I think that might even just be the easiest path. People need to really.
The thing is, like, we'd have to like thread it that way through every place it's used. Like, we wouldn't be able to know that a particular admission webhook or plugin is doing a thing that the user wanted to exclude in their dry run.
So I think
we have to pass the intent of dry running through
Right.
to them anyway. We can pass a non-boolean
Sure.
to them. How would you characterize the difference between those two desires, David? Is one like, is this going to be accepted, and the other is, I want to see the shape of the object?
That's a good way to put it.
Another one is independent of RBAC. Like this is like the more general problem.
Oh no.
Stop.
That I think it's a bridge too far for me.
Calm down. I'm not saying bypass RBAC. I'm saying there is a valid use case, which is I'm on a system. I want to look at a bunch of objects. I don't have a namespace. Am I, as a client, asking the question, is this object valid for this server, for this namespace, or valid for my rules plus that? I'm not saying we have to solve that in this particular API flow, but like let's not get too narrow. Like there's a little bit of like, let's not get tunnel vision on the thing that we have to go build right now, when the end goal is making sure that end users can make sure their objects are going to work.
Okay. So for the ones that I mentioned, there were concrete use cases for the image API for the quota thing, and there were concrete use cases for a cluster API from Caesar for the second thing.
Yeah. Do we have a good user cases list of like where is the cap? Do we want to put this in the cap, or do we want to?
We should probably make a separate cap for this.
I don't know.
Well, David, for the cluster API, I think the confidence about whether something will be accepted and what the final shape will look like is dependent on what namespace it's put in.
Yeah, I agree. And also, like, bypassing RBAC or something like that leaks a lot of information about
I wasn't
the
trying
system.
to argue for Clayton's point. I was trying to explain why do I have some things that want to run quota and be enforced and some things that don't, as opposed to the no namespace thing. I think that just representing the query parameter as a string and threading the string through, and then having, say, individual mission webhooks can look and say, do I support this string? Do I know what it means? If not, I'm going to reject kind of behavior.
We probably need to have the webhooks declare in advance which strings they support, because we can't just call you if we don't have confidence that you're not going to have some unexpected side effect on the resource. So I don't think we can have
that they need to indicate that they understand that the parameter is coming, but then the understanding the value of that parameter seems like the server that's being called could decide after it's already been called.
I mean, we would need the guarantee that a webhook, if it sees a string it doesn't understand, fails without doing anything.
Yeah, I think once it acknowledges, if we define this as a enum, and part of the definition is if you don't recognize, you have to reject, then acknowledging that they're expecting the dry run parameter is sufficient.
I wonder if we just want to tie this to phases. Like logically, like there's in the validation, I got to go back and look at Andy's original doc, but we actually talked about the difference between different types of validation. I'll have to go back and look at that. It's internal, like it's the object internally consistent. Is the object consistent within the other resources that might be in that namespace? Is the object consistent with limits that are applied to you? And I think there's one other distinction. Again, like I don't know that we need to implement all of them. I just want to think about these before we lock in an API, which string might be enough, but I just want to talk through it.
Here's what I suggest. I'm going to use a string, and for now it's going to go all the way, and we can decide later with a different proposal what we do with different strings.
Yeah, Antoine, will the code that we put in the previous or this current release reject things if it sees something other than a bool?
It is presence of the string, presence of the parameter only.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Which is perfect.
Yep. Yeah. Yes.
Occasionally, we make the right choice.
Luck is dumb.
Very good.
I'm good, and I have to go.
Okay, thank you, Antoine.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Janet, you want to go next?
Yeah. So hi, I'm Janet. I'm usually in SIG Apps, and I work on workloads APIs. So in SIG Apps, observed some limitations of garbage collection. So that's why I prepared this proposal to expand the garbage collections. And I plan to work on this in 112 release. So I don't plan to discuss the details of the design today because I just published it yesterday. So I would love everyone to take a look and give me some input. And then we can maybe discuss it in the next meeting.
Yeah. In particular, I think there's like 3 specific editions that could all be done independently. So it'd be good to like take a look, see if some of them are going to sail through, and if we need to discuss others in more detail to make sure that we don't confuse them, because I think they're all independently useful.
Okay. So the ask for the group is to take a look to the proposal, put your comments there, and then we will do a more formal and long presentation in the next meeting.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. And finally, Mike, you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just wanted to pick your brains and develop some understanding of, well, my original question was scaling in the garbage collector, but actually Clayton gave an answer that really answered the real question, which is really I'd like to understand everything that has some need to load all the objects. I mean, that's and I was concerned. I'd like to understand that. Just to follow up on Clayton's answer, let me just pick a few questions. So in the API servers, there is, may help me get the terminology right. There's this thing called Kube aggregator. And what I think of as the main API servers is built on the Kube aggregator, and then something that provides the in-tree types. And then someone with out-of-tree types can create additional API service objects that register where to find the API services that serve the out-of-tree types.
Yes, Stefan did a great presentation of that at KubeCon. If you've watched that recording on like 2x speed or something.
So my question was, in terms of who loads what objects, does the main API servers, does each of those load all of the objects or just the ones from the in-tree types, or what?
The main API server keeps, its storage keeps a cache of its own types, which it uses to satisfy watch requests. And that is all the main API server keeps in memory.
Yeah, I think we only construct the storage object once, and that same object gets threaded to all 3 API servers. Is that correct? I hope it's that way.
Yes, the informers should be shared amongst them all.
And the watch cache is underneath the storage abstraction, so there should be one watch cache.
Yeah, so each API server has a cache of its own types if it's using the standard Kube storage.
Yes.
So the garbage collector, the controller actually runs in the controller managers. So if you're asking about the garbage collector, yes. Oh, go ahead.
I meant to ask about both, and thank Clayton for answering about both. I was just trying to discuss them one at a time. So I think I've gotten most of the answer then about the API servers. So each one is going to load every object of every type that it's responsible for. And I think Clayton mentioned that if there's multiple versions in play, the watch cache is going to hold a copy of each of those versions.
Right. It's also worth remembering that your Kube API server may also maintain a second cache to be able to do lookups for things like authorization. RBAC will have a cache. And I guess node authorization, it will also have a cache of...
But those shouldn't be caching entire objects though, right?
They're
using
informers, so it's not all objects. It's specific objects.
Yes, but that's like config objects, like the webhook config or the RBAC policies. Yeah.
There's no cache in Kubernetes today that caches anything other than full objects. except the dynamic client under garbage collector, which we still haven't completely moved over to.
No, that actually stores full objects, always has. There was a bug.
Yeah, Dan was going to look at it, but he didn't get
the garbage collector's graph, I believe, only stores metadata.
Yes, the graph, but you saw the informers backing it, which store the whole object.
Correct. Yeah.
OpenShift has a few cases where we have started to have reflector-driven caches that only cache a subset of the object defined by the cache. Like you keep, the resource version, the name, and the namespace, and like a couple other fields that you can.
I didn't think we'd merged any of those yet. I thought those were still open polls.
We had some already in there. The trigger caches like that for image triggers. It's not quite as easy as it should be, but right now everybody caches informers and then builds indices on top of them with very few exceptions.
Yeah. So and the remaining thing to know about controller manager is that the controllers all share informers, so you don't get one copy of objects per controller that uses it. You get one copy of objects per controller manager binary that's running.
Right. Okay, so let's go on to the garbage collector. So the garbage collector runs in the controller manager, right?
Yes.
Okay, and the garbage collector loads everything except events. So it's loading the internal version which version?
External version.
Which external version?
That's actually garbage collector doesn't have a good way of knowing which. Yeah,
it loads the first listed version in each group of a resource. So if daemon sets appear in all three apps versions, it loads them from the first version listed in discovery.
Yeah, but it doesn't know that extensions daemon set is the same, or extensions deployment is the same as the apps deployment.
That's true.
I think we had to hard code that one.
I can't remember if we hard coded it or we might have. Those are slowly getting shut off in the extensions API group.
Yeah.
Network policy went away. We have a few left. But.
So what is the order in which the versions appear through discovery?
Discovery is supposed to list the API server's preferred version first.
Okay.
So if you actually go look at a discovery doc, you see the groups come in a particular order, and then within a group, you see the versions listed in a particular order.
Okay. Very good.
So I think because garbage collector index things by UID, so even if it watches for both extensions deployment and the apps deployment, internally they represent as one single node in the graph.
It assumes UIDs are unique across resource types.
Yeah.
And it has a REST wrapper that they are across resource types. They happen to be for those because they're shared. Backed by the same
well, I thought the point of UIDs is they're unique across everything.
Yeah, they better be unique. So
Okay.
I have a somewhat related thought, which is eventually we're going to have to think about sharding our controllers by namespace. I think is the only way to do it, because eventually we're going to have clusters that are big enough that we don't want to run all the controllers on one system for all resources.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm going, because as I've mentioned, I'm using Kubernetes API Machinery to build the control plane for something else, and we want it to be bigger than a Kubernetes cluster. So I'm trying to think about how, whether I need sharding, and if so, how. So
yeah, so the only way I can think of that will make sharding work is you have to shard. You can't shard within a namespace. You have to shard. You have to include entire namespaces. And the reason I think it has to be that way is because there's a lot of controllers that depend on the visibility guarantees. So like if you're a deployment controller, you have to look over all the replica sets in the namespace to see if any of them are owned by the deployment you're trying to control. So because of this visibility concern, I don't think that our system, I don't think it makes sense to shard our system into pieces smaller than a namespace. So I think we need to think about sharding groups, including entire namespaces, groups of namespaces. We don't have, right now from API Server, we support watching all namespaces or an individual namespace. We don't have a option where you can watch several namespaces. I mean, you could set that up with a series of watches yourself, but we wouldn't make that easy for you. So I think to support a good sharding mechanism, we have to start thinking about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to push back a little bit, which is I don't want to do sharding for the next year because I've got clusters that are bigger than everybody else's clusters, except maybe Huawei's, and it hasn't been a practical problem yet, except David keeps making things more inefficient, but that's not David's problem. That's just the architecture. So right now, the biggest clusters I know of peaked at about 20 gigs for the controllers, which is it was like three. That was something like it wasn't quite at the 5x load, but it was something like 3 to 4x.
Sorry, 3 to 4x what?
3 to 4x overlap due to redundant caches, garbage collector caching things, duplicate.
Okay.
And then as we split, we're getting more cache from scheduler and all that. We're still roughly in that range. I don't know that I'm worried about 100 gig memory clusters, which would be something for us, that would be 10 million keys, somewhere between 5 and 10 million keys in etcd, which is right at the limits of etcd anyway.
Although we're working on extending that. I think Joe is hoping to get etcd up to 16 gigabyte database size.
We've bounced off the limit several times on 8.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one of those things where I want to get everybody in the community to kind of buy off before we go do something really complicated, which is there's a lot of work to do sharding. In practice, do we really expect clusters to get past the 5 or 10 million key boundary?
That was the question I wanted to ask, which is number of keys. So you're telling me you're running 5 to 10. Well, how many keys are you running?
We're about 1 million right now. It's been a little bit higher at some points, and actually 90% of that is secrets because we have 3 service accounts per namespace. So we peaked at 20,000 namespaces, 3 service accounts per namespace, and 3 relatively large secrets per namespace. That's a part of the reason why the whole secret stuff is in, so that we'll cut that. We'd be back down to much smaller keys and smaller etcd size at 1 million, even without those. Those are about 100,000 secrets, and the other 900,000 are just the fan out from having 20,000 namespaces.
Okay, so in one part of the control plane I'm thinking about, life would be easy if I could have 27 million keys. And it sounds like you're saying my life is not going to be easy.
No. I mean, I don't think it's impossible to tune to get to that point. You're definitely pushing the edges of both what etcd and our frameworks.
Yeah, and storing things as JSON for CRDs may make it a little worse.
Yeah, I mean, I know most of the high cardinality by namespace resources are RBAC, quota, anything that you need 1 of per namespace because namespace roughly equals tenant. And that's about 1 million with 20,000. I mean, if you want to do that by an order of magnitude, it's within reason. But I feel like you get past that and you're starting to push up against the bounds of what the underlying stuff is going to work with. Is that the right solution?
So, I know what I was going to ask. Are those 27 million keys going to be in one namespace, or are you going to use multiple namespaces?
Yeah, they'll be split up among namespaces.
Okay. So, I mean, you could, if you want to manage watching each namespace individually, you could actually shard controller manager today. It wouldn't be easy. The thing that you can't do is get API server to or tell it I want to watch this range of APIs of namespaces. You can't get that.
Right. So I'm thinking about something. I'm talking about making an infrastructure cloud control plane using the Kubernetes API Machinery. So in an infrastructure cloud, we'll typically have a large number of tenants. Right. So we want to be able to handle thousands of tenants. So I'd hate to make a shard for each tenant. That would be too small, and I think that's where you're going, right? We want to have some kind of aggregation there.
Yeah, I can tell you there's sort of 2 ways you can do multi-tenancy, right? You can make things really, really big, or you can make things really, really small. So right, if it were basically cheap or free to operate an API server, then it wouldn't be so bad to run one per user, but it's not. So you could consider a middle ground, which is run multiple clusters. That has the additional, like you still get many of the benefits of operating a big multi-tenant service, but it gives you a smaller blast radius in case something goes wrong. So that's another thing to consider.
Well, I'm not quite sure I follow. I mean, if you're suggesting I run a Kube API servers, it would be multiple for reliability reasons. If I run a set of Kube API servers for each tenant, again, that's too many.
Right. Yeah, that's too many. But if you run a set of API servers for everybody altogether, then you have 27 million etcd keys. So what if you targeted like 5 million etcd keys and ran like 10 clusters? Right.
Yeah. Well, I might not even have to have a whole cluster. I mean, as we talked about earlier, it's this is for one particular kind of object. I could imagine doing some kind of sharding for that kind of object. The other kinds of objects are not so demanding.
Yeah. If it's just that one object.
But again, there's the garbage collector and there's the controller managers, and so it's not just the storage of these objects.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, garbage collector can be made a lot more efficient. A few people have suggested other types of meta controllers that deal only with either object meta or some similar interface. We could certainly probably get an order of magnitude improvement in efficiency there, but I think that'd be about the bar without more expensive stuff. I mean, like, I don't disagree that some form of sharding would be useful. I would want to lead that from sharding based on what makes organizational tenancy useful, or like security boundaries, like the difference between a cluster admin and every other user on the cluster. Trying to think through those cases. There's several proposals on those lines, like the.
Yeah, I think we can shard without worrying about making it a security boundary. I don't think we have to solve those problems at the same time.
No, I was saying I think the security boundary ones are more important problems than sharding and scale, because security boundary is, if you're going to have more and more people on these clusters, then we need to spend more and more time making sure you don't get outside your bounds. And like.
I could go either way on that one. I think there's a lot of people that would benefit from running bigger clusters. I don't know.
But I feel like, so I mean, and I'm not trying to be condescending or anything. It's like we're running really big clusters and it's not even our main problem. Like our problem is none of the controllers deal well at all with any failure modes. And so like at 1 million keys, like these are big databases, but the problems are not getting to 2 million or 3 million or 4 million keys. The problems are all most of the stuff we have.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you manage this with I'm surprised that your clusters don't blow up because of endpoints.
They blew up IP tables first. IP tables in the kernel is not efficient when you have 100,000 services.
No.
and Huawei hit this too. Like I kind of feel like the Huawei use cases and some of ours, like I'm not saying they're an absolute upper bound, but they kind of feel like, there's probably like 6 or 7 people who care about this scale. I would much rather spend our time on everybody who's at an order of magnitude smaller scale, make their lives easier.
Yeah.
It
sounds like I'm a little bit more in favor of sharding than Clayton is.
Well, I think if I understand Clayton, what you're telling me is it's not just a matter of how big it can be, but I think let me follow up on that. You're saying that you were saying something about how errors are handled is more of a problem. I mean,
a great example, we have like 5 Sev1 defects in OpenShift on 110 Kubernetes right now because the daemon set controller loses its goddamn mind. Pardon my language.
Where's Janet?
The daemon set controller, like some of the edge cases for failure modes, like if a particular node flakes out, impacts the entire daemon set controller. If a particular namespace has an insane request, and you're getting error backoffs because of admission plugins that don't allow certain things, going through the controller machinery and generalizing the lessons we've learned on controllers would probably benefit anybody who's at a high cardinality tenancy. And we haven't spent a ton of time make the generic controller that work that's going on in KubeBuilder be resilient to, if a particular namespace is erroring out, maybe we should just kick that namespace out of the queue for a while, stuff like that. So it's not that we're 100% broken. It's just that a lot of what we've seen, the mixed use clusters tend to fail. One error case propagates, controller goes crazy, saturates the API server. We're generally clamping those down. We got events, controllers are getting better, workload controllers are getting better, but we're still not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I noticed also in the multi-tenancy working group, which of course is meeting at the same time independently, they're having a discussion about exactly the issue of protecting against controllers that go crazy for one reason or another.
Well, they were looking at something slightly different. It looked like they wanted to try to introduce the concept of these namespaces are related and have different queue buckets. It looked very different.
That too. Yeah, that too. What I'm mentioning is that discussion has branched out and enlarged to include, I think, the concern of what happens when controllers go crazy or are taken over by some malicious actor.
I mean, they're conflating a couple concerns when they try to put those together, right? Like how you deal with controllers going crazy is not the same as how do I implement fairness amongst different sets of namespaces. Two different problems.
Right.
Yeah, there's an email thread or several email threads on this topic.
Yeah.
This is a super interesting topic, and I could probably go on about it all day, but maybe we should time box this and go on.
Yes, thank you.
Last item.
Yeah. So Martin, you want to?
Okay. So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's about recommendation. So I've been talking with Frederick from SIG Instrumentation, and right now the API library has a struct which, when you register metrics for Prometheus, you can define an endpoint which, when you send a delete request to it, it basically resets the metrics or just part of them. And according to him, this is a very bad anti-pattern, and we should probably get rid of it. And my question is, if we should get rid of it, should we
the only
remove
reason it exists was for SIG scalability, so you need to talk to SIG scalability.
Okay.
I added that SIG scalability had an inconsistent endpoint. They had added this originally so they could reset metrics during runs. And then we moved it to delete, which is where it is today. But then in general, this was a SIG scalability. They implemented it and made it a requirement just so they could reset. They could probably change it, but.
Yeah, because right now it only resets only like 5 or 10 of the metrics, not all of them. And yeah, okay, I'll talk to them. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure they could work around it. I think it was just the easiest thing at the time for someone to add an endpoint rather than to remember the previous metric state and do the delta by.
Yeah, because,
is there a reason why it's bad to use the delete verb to mean reset?
In the comment before mine, Frederick pretty much explained it why it's bad. I mean, by definition, you should pretty much restart the process when you want to reset the metrics.
It's not obvious to me that would be the only way to do it. I mean, I don't feel super strongly one way or the other, but saying I want to reset the metrics, resetting them.
Yeah, I mean, this use case was only because of something that SIG scalability testing was doing in their testing just to make something easier. I don't really think that this is a requirement for us. For their use case, the reason it was put in, they could probably just, at this point, parse the metrics and do a delta calculation. It's not that difficult.
Because I did a search on GitHub, and at least I couldn't find any reference to it, other than some documentation. No one is actually using it.
Yeah, it's almost certainly. I mean, Wojtek or Shyam would be the ones who could talk about how hard it would be to change.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Looks like
We have a couple minutes left over. Any additional things that we can talk about in like a minute?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I will upload the recording later today. Good luck, Daniel, with your adventure. And we'll see all of you in the next meeting.
Thank you.
Have a great day, night.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.